Tell us about Marette Oppenheim.
Ah, that's a nice question. Marette Oppenheim, are you familiar with her? So she was a surreal artist, or an artist associated with the surrealist movement. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. And when she arrived in Paris, aged 18, in 1932, one of the first things she did was to find a piece of marzipan and make a print of Giacometti's ear. She held this print, this little sculpture in her hand, and she walked across the rooftop of her apartment in Paris, holding it up to the sky. That was Marette's beginning in Paris. And I think you're asking this because I'm writing about Marette Oppenheim now. And that's where I start. I just think it's a very cool way to arrive in Paris.
It's wonderful, Deborah, that you bring this up, because we talked about this too when we talked a little bit about our conversation, that your work often begins with an image. You write visually, you say you think cinematically. Can you tell us about this visual impulse? And what images have you been drawn to of late, apart from this one?
Yeah. So I'm often asked, how do you begin, or where do you get your ideas from? And I suppose the real interesting answer to myself, because often, I don't know, is that it's an image. So when I wrote my novel, Swimming Home, I was researching the swimming pool that was the metaphor for the book, for the whole book, and discovered that a swimming pool is a hole in the ground. It's like a grave covered in water. And as my book was going to explore in quite a Freudian way the death wish, that seemed like a good beginning. When I wrote The Man Who Saw Everything, it's a novel about a careless, loving man. He loves men, he loves women, he tells lies to all of them, and they love him because he's very lovable. So we try and make things as complicated as possible. But I also wanted to write about the Berlin Wall coming down for various reasons. And so I didn't really know how to begin that. And I sat outside EMI Studios on the Abbey Road in London, looking at tourists cross the zebra crossing, the iconic zebra crossing on that album, Abbey Road. And it was like seeing a sort of history embodied, because there were tourists from all over the world who imitated the walk of one of their favorite Beatles. So Ringo walks like this and John walked like that. And I got really interested, and I thought, well, the Abbey Road is going to be the place. It's going to be the image, those black and white stripes of what in Britain we call a zebra crossing. I'm not quite sure what it's called in America.
A zebra crossing.
A zebra. And so, and then I thought, well, maybe he could just attempt to cross that crossing and then fall straight into East Berlin. I tried that for a while and then deleted it all because it seemed to set up a reality level that I wouldn't have been interested enough in pursuing for a whole novel, So, yeah.
So these are very particular images. Are there images that you feel return to you again and again? Kind of maybe motifs. I mean, it's funny that you bring up Marette. I did a bit of background research on her today. And she herself was drawn to kind of Carl Jung's archetypes and certain motifs, and she was particularly drawn to snakes and spirals, so I discovered. What for you are your kind of snakes and spirals?
Well, as you can hear, I'm not really going for symbols. I'm going for real, physical, concrete, material things like a hole in the ground and a zebra crossing. So I kind of work like that.
I think it's a leading question because I noticed some symbols in reading your trilogy, in reading some interviews, recent interviews that you've given. I don't know if it's a symbol, an image or motif, but certainly that of the shadow, this idea of the shadow returned, whether this idea of the shadow writer or the shadow woman came up quite a lot. The idea of the spectre too came up. I'd like to read one thing that you said, one thing that you wrote. So of reading Susan Sontag's diaries, you said, "I've always been interested in diaries. It seems to me there is a shadow writer at work in a diary, reaching for her truest thoughts. Like a shadow, she sees herself extended on the page, taller than her physical self." And then of motherhood, early on in the trilogy, and this is really just one description of many descriptions of motherhood. You write, "Now that we were mothers, we were all shadows of our former selves, chased by women we used to be before we had children. We didn't really know what to do with her, this fierce, independent young woman who followed us about, shouting and pointing the finger while we wheeled our buggies in the English rain." How do you think about shadows on and off the page?
I think about shadows like that. Like the ones you've read out and the ones that I wrote. They're not really symbols. So diary writing is very interesting because I think it's in a way we can, I mean, who are we speaking to when we write a diary? It is apparently a kind of expression of our own thoughts. And diaries famously, you know, have a little key. We all had one, I think, when we were kids, and we locked it and we kept the little key and we hid it somewhere. And if we didn't have a little key, we kind of found extraordinary hiding places for the diary, those of us who wrote them. And there are a few nods here, so I can see that you definitely had one. Or we found a sort of secret language for diary, so that if somebody found it, they wouldn't quite understand it. But I've always asked myself whether, in fact, diaries are a kind of plea to be found, that we quite like our diaries. It didn't feel like that at the time, to be read. And so we kind of an extended self in a diary. We're bigger than the person. The diary becomes bigger than the person writing it because it holds so many secrets and so many longings and anxieties, etc.
Well, you mentioned Susan Sontag, and we mentioned Moret, and this is characteristic of you, I would say, wanting to kind of talk about and highlight exuberant female artists. You're in conversation with many of them in the trilogy: Marguerite Duras, Simone de Beauvoir, Julia Kristeva, Audre Lorde, Louise Bourgeois. And yet, by contrast, a central preoccupation of the trilogy is the absence of writing about particular women. This is a woman in her 40s, 50s, 60s. She's roasting chickens that she's bought from Tesco Express. She's wondering how to live a creative life. She's living a creative life. You described this woman and her life as undocumented. These are undocumented years of female experience. Can you tell us about these undocumented years of female experience that you noticed as you set out to write the trilogy?
Yeah, so so all the quotes from those female writers and artists, why are they there? they're there because they have meant so much to the writer. They're not there because they're clever, which they are. What's the point of that? They're there because they also lift up and flow with some of the themes in the book, some of the inquiries in the book. So I think your question is sort of why write this trilogy, and in what way is it undocumented experience? I understand that question, but I have to answer it another way. I think that if everyone in this room wrote about their life as they really feel it, this would be undocumented experience. That sounds like a very sort of bold and obvious thing to say, but it's actually very subtle, because you have to kind of access to access feelings isn't easy. So we're not going to write on Tuesday I felt sad, and on Thursday things lifted. That might be a conversation in a pub, or indeed in our teenage diaries. So for my generation, men were supposed to do all the thinking and women were supposed to do all the feeling. And this was something that women of my generation really disliked, that you couldn't have a full intellectual life and document it. Were our thoughts valuable? Were they of any value? So when I started Things I Don't Want to Know, which is the first book in the trilogy.
Which is a response to George Orwell's Why I Write.
Yes.
Yeah.
So George Orwell in 1946 wrote a very short essay called Why I Write. And he has 4 headings: political purpose, historical impulse, sheer egoism or egotism, and what was the third? Aesthetic enthusiasm. So although the language is a little bit strange, I thought that they held up. And I decided to steal his titles and to give them a spin from a female writer's point of view, from my point of view. And so I put up political purpose on the screen. I typed it in. And what happened was this. Here was the first line of political purpose. That spring, when life was very hard and I was at war with my lot and simply couldn't see where there was to get to, I seemed to cry most on escalators at train stations. Going down them was fine, but there was something about standing still and being carried upwards that did it. From apparently nowhere, tears poured out of me, and by the time I got to the top and felt the wind rushing in, it took all my effort to stop myself from sobbing. It was as if the momentum of the escalator, carrying me forwards and upwards, was a physical expression of a conversation I was having with myself. And I couldn't believe it. Political purpose. That spring, when life was very hard and I was at war with my lot and couldn't see where there was to get to, I thought, is that even all right? But I was kind of interested. I was anxious about it, but I was interested when I read it back. So if you're spending your time in a writing cabin, a shed, as I was writing this book, and you read back your work at the end of a long day and you're not interested, that's not all right either. But I was interested and I decided to continue in this voice. And eventually I began to discover why it was under the heading political purpose. The hardest thing really was to write the I, the female narrator, someone who's quite a lot like me, but not exactly me either.
Where's the divergence? Where are the divergences?
Well, the divergence is obvious because there has, as I say, it's not a conversation with a best friend. It's not a conversation over a pizza. It's a work of literature that has to find its artifice and has to find a voice to steer the reader, to interest the writer enough to interest the reader, because I suppose that the first person is very claustrophobic.
This is really interesting that you say that, because you said of Annie, so Annie knows the years. There's Annie, she writes her autobiography in the not in the first person. She writes it using they and she and we, and it's a kind of collective autobiography of her time in France growing up. Yeah. And you talked about that as an experimental version or example of autobiography.
I'm not sure if it's experimental because it's achieved, you know.
Yes, yeah.
But I think that I hadn't read the years, you know, when I was writing things that I want to know. So the thing was, how do you insert other subjectivities into your book, writing in the first person? That's technique. And that was something I had to learn for this book and for the two that followed. And I've said this before, but I think the most interesting part of this was to find a voice that was intimate and formal. Because sometimes intimacy is, we recoil from intimacy, don't we? If somebody is sort of speaking too closely to us, we sort of recoil. So it's better to somehow find a tone that is formal too, to accept them, to somehow accept the writing.
Well, I mean, you use the word claustrophobic, and I was going to ask you about this too, because you've said of your fiction, as you say, I mean, I'll just fill out the quote as it were, that the first person can sometimes be too close. And of the first person, you've said, you need to open the windows a bit and let in the fresh air. It's a lovely kind of the idea of flowing in fresh air.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I called them living autobiographies because they're written more or less in the storm of life. My understanding of autobiography is that you're kind of looking wisely at your life over your shoulder. Wisdom is so boring. So I didn't really want to do that. And so I thought, okay, I'll just call this mashup of memoir, travel writing, philosophy, politics. I'll call them living autobiographies, because they're also not nostalgic. There is a sort of idea too that when we look back on our lives, we're nostalgic for something. And this might be really sad, but I'm not nostalgic for anything. Maybe if I write my fourth one, I might be nostalgic for this moment here with you.
Well, I mean, again, to this point of omniscience, you said this too of your fiction, so it's curious to put it in conversation with your autobiographies. What you won't find in my novels, you said, on the whole, are grand narrators, wise and all-seeing. No, I don't want them in my book.
I really don't.
You mentioned the writing shed, Deborah, and it highlights something I wanted to ask you too that struck me reading this and reading your interviews, is that your very honest description of writing as work, as hard work. I think in a world that often sanitizes the process and fetishizes the product, you offer a counterpoint, which is that writing can be a slog, it's financially precarious, it can be a long haul, it takes stamina, brute force. I mean, so Deborah, after she kind of deals with Hollywood, buys this lovely chateau, and she starts writing, I think, 10 hours a day, and she says of that, I'm writing like a brute. I mean, there is a sense of, there's a physicality to it. And I wanted to ask you about this physicality, because we don't often hear about writing as brute force, as physical. And there's this lovely description of you early on. This is you using your typewriter. You write, the action of hammering its keys for the length of writing a novel would sometimes make a small callus on the tip of my second finger. In this sense, it really was a tool, like a scythe or saw. It required physical effort to use it. And it reminded me of this lovely poem, very famous poem, Seamus Heaney's Digging, which ends. So he's basically writing poetry in his room, and he looks out and he sees his father outside digging for potatoes, I believe, in the ground. And he's wondering, what am I doing writing when my father is so dexterous with his shovel? The poem ends, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
I wonder how the potatoes are coming along. Well, yes, writing is work, of course, but all art is work. I mean, this I don't know what else what we think that is, what else we think it is. Maybe there's a very sort of romantic idea about art and artists and writers. And in a way it is romantic, because it's an incredible blast to actually pour something onto the page that's totally incoherent and then find its coherence, to smell the smoke of ideas becoming manifest on the page. That's incredible. That's an incredible moment. So in terms of the living autobiographies, another way of answering that question is, I didn't want to make the narrator less powerful than she is, or more modest than she is, or more fragile than she is, or stronger than she is. So this all sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But you try finding a voice that in which all those things, power and fragility, and coherence and incoherence, we're great on Monday and then we make no sense on Friday, can coexist and keep us interested. So why I'm not really interested in wisdom in my book, and what that is a whole other conversation, is because it's something that, unless it's kind of struggled into, right? This is why I hate proverbs as well. I think it's quite interesting to, if the writer is skilled, to witness something struggled for in a book, because there is this idea that everyone in a book is incredibly articulate, sorted in one. You can have a character who's emotionally very stable, or another character who's emotionally very unstable. Well, how about just sort of mixing the two a bit? That would be all of us. And then try and find a language to honor that, not to mock it. And then find a language not to preach that, but to put it up as a way of being in the world, because it is how we exist in the world. So that was my project with all three books. 40 yellow 150, red 160.
Do you have examples? I mean, I was thinking we don't want to cite alive authors, but dead authors who, on the one hand, preach wisdom. So we can kind of make this a concrete in our heads. Maybe people who preach, who you're adverse to, and then people who you think do this deftly. You look to for examples.
Well, I'll tell you who never preached. There's a writer like Toni Morrison, such an extraordinary writer. So you read a massive book like Beloved. There's no preaching there. Her rage, the rage to write that. Now that might be a shadow, but let me tell sort of over the book or under the book, the writer's shadow, knowing that this was so important that so wisdom, a lot of wisdom, but we never kind of preach. We've shown brutality and in a way that we can feel it. That's what the writer has to do. Writing isn't really about being able to feel things. Because when we can really feel things, we can change the world. But we're so distant. We're so sort of cut off from that I don't know. I think the world isn't in a very good place at the moment.
And for you, you feel through writing. That's how you feel most deeply, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Or you read the essays of James Baldwin, you know, the sort of the critical thinking is always embodied. It's never there to there's never faux wisdom, right? It's just there. It's there burning a hole through the page. It's just, you know, that's the sort of writing that I love. Yeah.
I want to talk about, so you've said of your fiction, so it's nice to use your fiction in contrast to your nonfiction. The odd thing about books, I mean, maybe you would change this now, but you said this to the White Review. The odd thing about books is that you have to forget the last book in order to write the next one. Surely the odd thing about autobiographies is that you have to remember the last book and very much remember in order to write the next one. But here's an interesting distinction, I think, which is that you've said, or maybe we can say that in some ways, remembering can also be misremembering. So when one looks back, one can re-remember something or misremember something, which actually is a form of forgetting. Can you talk about this kind of tension between remembering and forgetting and misremembering and forgetting?
Well, that'll be all of us. It's
on Monday and Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, forgetting and remembering is a very interesting subject. When we forget something that hurt us, say, Freud called that motivated or simulated forgetting. So autobiographical writing is all about remembering and forgetting. The great writer, J.G. Ballard, the British writer, said that he was asked why he wrote a certain book, and he said, it took me 25 years to forget and 25 years to remember. And I think that's very cool. I think that's true. In terms of fiction, I think we would have to talk about how time works, because time and remembering and forgetting are all sort of all kind of work together. So in The Man Who Saw Everything, its leading protagonist, a man who really sees very little, his memory is all over the place. And some of what he remembers might not be accurate. But then some of the ways we're told history works might not be accurate either. Depends who's doing the telling. And so The Man Who Saw Everything is a book about history and time, and how history is as subjective in its telling as anything else.
As fiction. I mean, thinking about The Man Who Saw Everything. So this is so there's a character in The Man Who Saw Everything called Jennifer, who at one point in the novel says, "There's a spectre lurking in every one of my paragraphs." And in an interview talking about this,
Photographs.
Photographs. Yes, I haven't read the book. I was reading an interview. She says, "There's a spectre lurking in every one of my photographs." And what you said explaining this is, what she meant is, in a work of art, something is always hidden. All art is what you reveal and what you conceal, or it's about making something invisible visible. And so I was also thinking about, how does revealing and concealing, do you think, relate also to this idea of remembering and forgetting?
So all writing is about revealing and concealing, and all of life is about revealing and concealing. You'll see that I'm always very keen to not separate my writerly interests from my interests in life. So I'm very interested in how we reveal and how we conceal. I'm interested in how the postman reveals and conceals information at Christmas. And that's a short story that I'm writing now. So giving information at the right time, why we reveal something in literature, when we conceal it, surface and depth, all of these are obviously my preoccupations when I write, but they are my preoccupations eating a bowl of noodles with friends too. So you'll never get from me, as a very nerdy writer, someone who spends most of her time doing just that, I will never talk about writing in any other way than it's a chance to explore the preoccupations that interest me in life, and to exclude the things that I think make books dusty and fusty and irrelevant. One of the cruelest things about writing is that I think we're only as interesting as where we're putting our attention, how are we looking at something, what we choose to look at. So it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. If you can make wonderful sentences, and where your attention is and what you're looking at is just plain boring, I don't care. I won't read that book. So if we're not interested in the mind of the writer, what's the point?
You use the word explore, and I think it touches on another word that's often been ascribed to your work, to which you adverse to, and I used it earlier and you were quick to jump on it. So let's talk about experimentation and risk. You've said an artist is nothing if she does not experiment or take risks, and not just artists. Imagine someone saying, I never experimented with anything in my life, and I never took a single risk. And yet the kind of the genre, if you like, although you've also said that you're anti-genre, so it's anti-genre, anti-experimentation. But oftentimes experimentation, bad writing, you've said weak writing is pushed into the phrase of experimental writing, and actually experimental writing, as you said when I mentioned it about Annie Arnaud, is achieved writing. Can you talk about this large phrase, experimental writing, as it relates to possibly bad writing today?
I think experimental writing was, when writing is described as sentimental or experimental, it's usually, the experimental label is often used to beat up in a very mocking way some interesting writing. So what do we do about that? That's a question. So we would need critics with the critical apparatus to understand how that writing is made. That's much more important than blaring on about what experimental writing is. It'd be much more interesting for all of us, and especially literary critics, to have to have the tools to understand how writing that is unfamiliar is made, is created. That's a much more interesting subject than what is mainstream writing and what is experimental writing. So that's first. Yes, risk. Well, it's usually, I find when I'm writing, when I take a risk, something changes in the writing. There's something alters. It becomes, it's not that it becomes edgier necessarily, but there's more at stake, you know. So I remember when I was writing my novel Hot Milk, a daughter is wheeling her mother, who is a hypochondriac and whose legs are sometimes lame and sometimes not. And she's in a wheelchair at this stage, and they're in the southern Spain. They've gone to Spain on a kind of pilgrimage to find a cure for her mother's legs. And Sophia has just seen her mother walk across the beach. So she knows she can walk. But the next chapter, and this is taking a risk, our mother's in a chair and Sophia sees they're crossing a big highway, and a truck, a long lorry, is coming from the left. And Sophia wheels her mother into the middle of the road, and she leaves her there. That was a risk. I mean, I wrote that and I looked at it and I thought, well, is that true? Is it psychologically true? Because I don't want you, my readers, to think Sophia's a psychopath or unhinged. So what's going on? Her mother stands up. She leaves her chair in the road and she walks to the other side. But Sophia knew she could. And so that's a risk. That's a risk in all sorts of ways in the writing. And if you're talking about risks in the form of writing, oh my goodness, that's what every single writer should be doing.
Are they? A contemporary writers taking formal risks, you think?
Yeah, some of them. All the same old suspects.
There's also the kind of creative risk. And I read this brilliant description of you saying that occasionally, I don't know if you do it anymore, you used to get rid of or burn or throw away parts, a page or two of a piece of work. And then
never burnt it. No, I mean, God.
No, but
we delete it.
Okay.
I delete it. I don't have offcuts.
But then you did that to one particular moment in one of your drafts and you regretted it. So you no longer do that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about this?
So I was writing Swimming Home, and I suppose that this is another dare when I write. Most people, sensible people, have a file with offcuts. And so something doesn't quite work and you paste it up in the file and you'll use it elsewhere. You don't, or you didn't? I do and I don't. If there's something that I think I can use elsewhere, or something that interests me enough not to delete, I will put it in a file. But if something's just quite good and I'm coasting along, I think, no, I'm going to delete it completely. I'm not going to save it. because if I save it, it's a bit like I'm holding it hostage and nothing interesting will happen. Nothing at all.
Except in this one particular moment, you regretted the
Oh,
delete, the
I
brutal delete.
I do. I actually think about this quite a lot to this day. It was when I was writing Swimming Home, and it was a very long haul, that book. I used to write it till about 4 a.m. in one phase of getting that novel out. And there was a car alarm that went off in my street at about 4 a.m. I used to think, oh, good, it's the car alarm. It was sort of like, I think I'll sleep now. And it was in that kind of, I don't know, writing struggle, that I wrote a page that I miss to this very day because I deleted all of it. As far as I remember, it was 2 characters playing ping pong with helicopters above them, and they're talking to each other while they play ping pong, and they're having to shout over the helicopters. And I really miss that piece of writing. Like I yearn for it, but it's no longer. So we just talk about it.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for Deborah Levy? Thank you. So now I will refer you to Emily Biggs, who's our program assistant, who will come to you with questions. Or you'll ask the questions.
Hi, brilliant as always. I'd like to ask you a question about structure.
Sure.
I've only read the first 2 volumes of the autobiography. You mentioned the framework for things I don't want to know. I thought it was absolutely brilliant the way you used Orwell's essay as a framework to structure the story. How did you go about structuring the cost of living?
Yes, well, thank you, Jake Lamar. I knew that it couldn't be chronological because I don't think memory works like that. And I don't like autobiographical writing, which kind of starts with the young years, aunts and uncles, mom and dad, brothers and sisters. I usually skip that and I get to about 16, 17 when the protagonist has some ideas of their own. I'm not saying that's a good thing, it's just kind of how I read. So I wanted to start with The Tempest. It is actually a title in the cost of living. I was thinking about the tempest in my own life. My marriage was shipwrecked. And then I began to think about the tempest. And then I began to put it together that way. So here we go. You did ask about structure. I didn't want to start chapter 2 with I, because it's so claustrophobic. This is called The Tempest. Everything was calm. The sun was shining. I was swimming in the deep. And then when I surfaced 20 years later, I discovered there was a storm, a whirlpool, a blasting gale lifting the waves over my head. At first, I wasn't sure I'd make it back to the boat. And then I realized I didn't want to make it back to the boat. Chaos is supposed to be what we most fear, but I have come to believe it might be what we most want. If we don't believe in the future we are planning, the house we are mortgaged to, the person who sleeps by our side, it is possible that a tempest, long lurking in the clouds, might bring us closer to how we want to be in the world. Life falls apart. We try to get a grip and hold it together. And then we realize we don't want to hold it together. So there's a lot of we in that, and I, and whether. So I wanted to start like that. I wanted to start with a tempest, literally a tempest. And then I knew that somehow I was going to end with the Marguerite Duras quote that I won't give away if you haven't read, that somehow I was going to work towards that. And that gave a rhythm and momentum to the way I was going to organize the structure, which goes back and forth in time and sometimes is chronological. I wanted to give value to the everyday, getting through a day in a tempest. And that would give a rhythm and in terms of structure, it might mean that the next chapter would be calm and still, because we can't just have, tempest blows us around. We need to sit and find some peace and gather our thoughts. So something like that. Second chapter. Yeah. Why? Because there are some arguments to be pursued that are going to come up later in the book. And I prefer to embody my arguments and preach them.
Any other questions? Yes. Hi, I'm Ellie. There's a lovely part in, I think it's in Real Estate, where you're in Paris and you see some shoes. And I work in fashion, so it popped out to me. I wondered if you could tell us about the shoes you're wearing tonight and why you chose them, and whether you've indulged in any new shoes in Paris this time.
They're called the character shoes, interestingly.
Yes. There are shoes in Real Estate, but they're not these ones. Are they not that dissimilar either? And have I bought any new shoes in Paris? Not yet, but tell me what I should be looking for.
Yes, other questions? Don't be shy. Okay.
Anyway, you're a new author for me, and I'm very excited about that. You said that your autobiographical, your living autobiographies are a hybrid, and you mentioned travel writing. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, hello, sorry about that. I do a lot of travel, and I always incorporate it in my work, and I love travel writing. I love to read it myself, so I like to write things that I like to read. So if you read these 3 books, you will see that Real Estate, the red one, is set in Berlin, it's set in London, it's set in Mumbai. I like the shift of. I like to travel through a book, and although that sounds very literal, I see no reason why it shouldn't be there. In fact, if we could just find so Mumbai, which was Bombay. I'm at a literary festival in Mumbai, and I can't. I'm trying to check in on for my airplane back, and I'm putting Mumbai in instead of Mumbai, Mumbai instead of Mumbai, and that's because I'm thinking about my mother, who's recently died, and the convener who I told this to said, "Oh, it's not the first time that Bombay's had its name changed. You could just call it Mumbai." So there are all kinds of continuations of themes in my book, and they happen in many countries. The preoccupations are the same, but they happen everywhere.
I see some questions in the room. We have one on Zoom as well. Hillary on Zoom is curious about your playwriting. She wants to know if you're still writing plays, and if not, why not?
Oh, thank you, Hillary. That's a great question. I so miss writing for the theatre. I miss its collaborative energy, and I keep thinking, how am I going to write for the theatre again? What would I write? And I do have a notebook of ideas for that, but I have to say that I haven't actually begun to write for the theatre again. My work is often adapted for the theatre and for performance in often site-specific performances. Maybe when I have a bit of a rest, when I finish my next novel, I'll write something for the theatre. I learned to edit very quickly from my early theatre days, because if you're sitting in rehearsals, it's the playwright and there's a skilled actor saying your words, and you've written a weak line, you feel so humiliated because, you know, this line just dies in their mouth. And so I got good at rewriting there and then very quickly. Yeah.
You mentioned your new novel and you said that you would tell us 3 lines about it.
Okay. It's called August Blue, and it's about a piano virtuosa, a woman who has played a certain piece of classical music, challenging, well-known piece, many, many times. And when the novel starts, she's played this piece of music at a mighty venue, and she's messed it up. And the novel is about why.
Yes, over here.
I'm almost finished with real estate, and your writing sheds seems to also be a theme. Have you found a writing shed in Paris? And if so, what is it?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. I have sort of found the equivalent of a writing shed, although it's not a shed. I think you'd call it a loft. Would that be so? So it's a little bit posher.
A lot posher.
Than my writing shed. It's a very good place to work. Thank you for asking.
I think we have time for one more question. Someone in the back has been raising her hand. Do you still want to ask it? Okay.
Hi. So my question is more on your writing process, specifically on your like nonfiction. So like I was just like curious, since it's divided into 3 like living autobiographies, like how did you know when to stop, or like a particular story was finished and that it was ready to go out in the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it would apply to any sort of book. And the answer would be when you have said everything you need to say. When there's nothing else to do is when you know you've finished a book.